I'd like to make a few points in regard to your video on unionization. You you seem to place some correlation between income for the very wealthy and economic downturns. And I'm not sure what business cycle theory you're drawing this from. It almost seemed as if your presentation was a mass of inchoate statistics called from dubious sources to pursue your predetermined agenda. But whether or not that is the case, I think that we really got to talk about business cycles and why they happen, because the Depression of 1929 and our current economic crisis that just occurred with regards to subprime mortgages, the housing bubble collapse, these things have very real causes. And you'll note if you study depressions, recessions, economic downturns, sideways adjustments, whatever you want to call them, you'll note that the trouble is located in capital goods industries. The Keynesian explanation for business cycle theories, which you probably subscribe to if you subscribe to any, is that there's a failure of aggregate demand in consumer spending. But if this was the case, you would think that the economic turmoils would be concentrated mostly in consumer goods industries. The reality is that depressions are the result of malinvestment in the economy by entrepreneurs. The state artificially manipulates interest levels to create temporary prosperity through a policy of easy credit. So what happens is the Federal Reserve buys up government bonds, creating new money and expanding credit. Now, entrepreneurs, they forecast the future, and they're pretty good at it. It's very difficult to do, of course, but they're pretty good at it because most firms make profits most of the time. But in a recession, what you see is all of a sudden the forecasts are inaccurate and you have the cluster of errors. You have a whole bunch of businesses failing all at once. And this is why we can understand that the cause of business cycles has to be in the money supply, because what else touches all aspects of the economy but money? We're not talking about failure in one industry, which can happen for any number of reasons. We're talking about systemic failure as a whole, almost suddenly without a very obvious cause. Often after a war, you'll see problems in the economy, but there the cause is obvious. We spent all our money blowing stuff up instead of building new factories. So we got this downturn. But recessions seem almost as if they come out of nowhere. So why do we have business cycles? It's because, as I was saying, of state manipulation of the interest rates. So artificially low interest rates give you see, interest rates on the market are determined by the time preference of consumers, how much they want to save as opposed to consume. And I mean, you can't really say what people's time preferences should be. That's an individual decision. But state manipulation, Federal Reserve or Bank of Canada or central bank manipulation of the money supply fools entrepreneurs into thinking that consumers' time preferences are longer. There's more credit available. They think that people are saving more. And And when people's time preferences are elongated, when they're saving more, that means there's more money available for investment in capital goods industries, long-term projects. Conversely, if people's time preferences were shortened, if they wanted stuff now, what is time preference, you ask? For example, a drug user is a very high time preference individual. They want something right now. You know, people that want instant gratification. These are high time preference individuals. People that put things off. People that save for their future or their grandchildren's future. These are low time preference individuals. So the problem is that consumer time preference actually hasn't changed. These investments in capital goods industries that were caused, I suppose, it's not exactly what I want to say, by the price signals being distorted by the artificial manipulation of interest rates. These time preferences aren't real. People aren't actually saving more money. And eventually the market corrects for this, and then you have the bust. And everybody hates depressions. You know, people are out of work. You can have stagflation. You can have inflation during this time period. Although, like, usually you don't have. Usually prices come down during a depression. That's part of the market correction. But if monetary policy is really bad, then it's a bad time, you know. But in reality, it's actually a very good time because the economy is correcting. We're getting back on a more stable foundation. The malinvestments are being liquidated, and resources can be better allocated towards serving consumer needs. So I don't think there's much to your theory, your correlation between your statistics on how much income the rich are making, or what relevance there is. I think this is a question of economics, and you have to go to economic theories if you want to look at it. Now, you claim that we need more unionization. I think you're flatly wrong. I think that unions are at best, and generally they are useless, but at worst they're harmful. There's no benefit to having a union because, as you touched upon, wages are determined by productivity. Now, we could look at your statistics and go through that on a case-by-case data point. I think it's better to understand this logically than to just throw a bunch of numbers out there. I mean, you can tease the data, torture the data, and prove anything you want, but it doesn't mean you're actually right. But it'd be good if you posted sort of a link to where you're getting all this stuff from. Maybe compile it all to a website or something, just to, we can see where you're going wrong, why you have this misunderstanding about how the economy works. You don't need unions. Wages are determined by productivity. And you had an example of, like, you go to an employer and he offers you a job at $12. You say you can't counter with 20. Why not? Of course you can. I do it implicitly by not applying for $12 jobs all the time, right? And the employer doesn't have to say yes to your $20 request, right? I want to work for $20, but that's me. It all depends on your circumstances. And flatly, I don't think there's anything wrong with working for $12. I know at many times in my life I would have been ecstatic to get employed at $12 an hour, but unions have no power to raise wage rates. And when they do, I'm sort of contradicting myself, but if they do raise wage rates, then it comes, as a consequence, comes with it unemployment, just as if you try to raise wage rates through government fiat, say by establishing some sort of a minimum wage, then you're going to have unemployment. And if you look at the data between teenage unemployment in America and the introduction of the minimum wage, you see, off the charts correlation here. You see that as soon as the minimum wage is introduced, and teenagers are an example of unskilled workers. So this demonstrates what this policy does for poor, unskilled workers, people that need our help more than anybody else in our society. What does it do? It makes them unemployable. It says it is now a crime to hire this person. That's why I think the minimum wage is disgusting. I think it's an extremely important, I think it's politically extremely important that we repeal the minimum wage immediately. And even advocates, even the minimum wage system itself implicitly, understands this, because you've got lower minimum wages for unskilled workers, for students, for servers, for waitresses. And why? Because these people are low skilled, because you can't afford to pay them the full wage. But what about somebody who's not a student or not a server that's got a low skill set? Why should we prohibit them from being employed when these are the people that need to be employed the most, because then they can gain some more skill sets, some work experience, so they can learn how to be punctual and dress well and all these other things. So basically, I think you're out to lunch, but I'm glad you made your video, and hopefully you have a chance to watch mine and respond. Thank you.